Buying or selling a home is one of the most important decisions you'll make in your entire life. Call the Holly Ritchie team today for a free market analysis.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Spanning the Need, Stories of Your Lifestyle. Hey, it's Teacher Appreciation Week. And who else to talk about that is the president of Ohio Education Association, Scott DiMauro, who is also an actual teacher. You may think that because he's president of OEA, he is actually he is a teacher. Am I right, Scott?
I am. I just finished my 31st year in education. I'm a high school social studies teacher. Spent most of my career teaching in the Columbus area, in the Worthington schools, which is a suburb outside of Columbus. I'm not currently in the classroom because the OEA work takes all of my time. But yes, once a teacher, always a teacher. And when I'm done with this work, I'll probably go back to the classroom.
Well, and I think that's a good opportunity to kind of show like, hey, if you're still in that OEA position, you are still back in the classroom. You're still a teacher. You still have the heartbeat of helping our kids. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Well, it's Teacher Appreciation Week. What do you think about that? I mean, as we get farther into the week, the Spanning the Need will be honoring local teachers and area teachers, people that really go above and beyond. And I'll say this, all teachers go above and beyond. People may think that, and I'll be honest, I substitute taught for 4 or 5 years, talking with teachers. I still talk to teachers now. It's just not a 9-to-5 gig. I mean, so Scott, talk about your experience in teaching before you kind of became involved in OEA, because I think people need to kind of understand. You said parent teacher conferences, and kind of talk about kind of like what's the back end of teaching.
Yeah, I mean, teaching is a lot of work, and as we talk about Teacher Appreciation Week, I think it's important one to recognize the heroic work that teachers do in the classroom every day. Also lift up not just teachers, but education support professionals, people that serve other roles like counselors and nurses and social workers and mental health specialists and bus drivers and school secretaries and cafeteria workers, all of whom serve as educators in one way or the other. And OEA represents 120,000 educators from across the state. So, we celebrate everybody here. But I'll just tell you a little bit about my personal story. I originally I went to college at Miami University in Oxford, and I was a political science and history major. Thought I was going to go into, public service or go to law school or do something related to politics. And I did an internship one summer while I was in college in Washington, D.C. for my local member of Congress. And while I was there, I had a great learning experience. I mean, as a poli-sci major, it was incredible. But I came away a little bit disillusioned in a way, because I saw that politicians were making decisions based on what was popular. And I thought they were making some bad decisions actually at the time. And so really encouraged by some of my friends, and I'd already started taking a few education classes. I decided then that the way I was going to make the most difference for the most people was not in politics or law or things like that. It was in the classroom. It was by helping kids become better critical thinkers and problem solvers and decision makers, so that they could be good citizens. And if we have more good citizens, then hopefully that's putting positive pressure on politicians to make good decisions, and that's good for our community. So I went into education, haven't looked back since. It's the best decision that I ever made. There hasn't been a single day in my educational career that I haven't been very, very glad that I made that choice, because it does make such a difference. And what's really rewarding for me is talking to former students, who say, hey, you really helped me in your class just see things differently and really gain a wider perspective, and help me, just be a better person. And that makes all the difference in the world. So yeah, it's really rewarding. And this is a time to celebrate.
You probably regret it when you first met me.
Not at all.
And we talk about like I said, Teacher Appreciation Week every year. And I'll say this, teaching, I should say education in general, has changed since I went to school 20 years ago. And please don't age me, where I'm taking algebra in like 10th, 11th grade. Now they're doing it in like fourth and fifth grade. So how does teachers kind of change with the times? Because as you know, they're going through extensive training year after year, professional development. And that's not, like we mentioned earlier, not just teachers, but professional educators in general.
Yeah, I mean, curriculum has changed to a degree. One of the things that's driven a lot of that, and this has been one of the not so great aspects of education in the last 20 years or so, has been an increasing emphasis on standardized testing. And for a lot of teachers that I talk to around the state, it's been really frustrating not being able to really do the things that I think most people choose education as a field for, and that is to unleash students' creativity and imagination and desire to learn. And there's certainly an element of that, and that's very fulfilling. But unfortunately, there's a lot of pressure on just being prepared for tests. So that's one of the not so great aspects. I think the other thing that has changed a lot though has been students. And especially I've been doing a lot of visiting of schools in the last few weeks, and one of the things that I keep hearing is that kids, especially coming out of the pandemic, just have tremendous needs. And it's not just about attending to kids' academic needs and making sure that we're providing them with skills to do well in math and reading and writing and learn social studies and science and all those kinds of things, but knowing that a lot of kids have mental health challenges. A lot of kids are coming from families where they don't have enough food to eat, where there's a lot of other issues. And your foundation, I know, is doing really, really good work to help fill some of those gaps. But that puts a lot of pressure on educators. And when you see the amount of inequity that exists in our state, between districts and then even within schools, it more and more has been put on the plate of educators, because in a lot of ways it's the most stable environment that a lot of kids have. So we have to do a lot to meet the needs of the whole child, to create a safe learning environment, to make sure that every single student, regardless of their race or their background or how much money their parents have, that every kid comes to school knowing that they're going to be supported and they're going to be nurtured, and there's an adult in that classroom who's really committed to their success. And that takes its toll. That's hard. It's a lot to expect of people. And then you layer on top of this the other thing that's happening right now that is really unfortunate, is that so much of education is being politicized, and you see these attacks and kind of crazy fights about stuff that's not even real. Attacks related to race or gender issues or things like that. When I talk to my colleagues and our members across the state, they just want the freedom to be able to do their jobs and help their kids. So it's tough. And NEA, our national organization, recently did some polling, and they show that more teachers than ever before are talking about feeling burnt out, are thinking about leaving the profession early, and really feel like they're not being supported in the way that they need to be supported. So this Teacher Appreciation Week, it's not just a time to celebrate, but it's also a time to, I think, ask some pretty hard questions about what are some of the changes that we need to make sure that educators really are supported, are fairly compensated, do have the kinds of working conditions in their schools that enable them to do the very important work that they're called to do with students every day.
Well, I think you also go back to the professional development side, and you kind of look at how you're maybe grooming is the wrong word, but bringing up uprising in their educational degrees. What does that look like to mold them into what's necessary for the leaders of tomorrow, as you like to say when we teach our students? And we look at that because I think those have changed. Those targets have kind of changed in a variety of different ways that have either been politicized or said those are the right things to do. Well, no, they're not, from a variety of different people, no matter far right, far left, or down the middle. So how do you gauge that? Because you, like you said, ask those hard questions. Like, should we be teaching this over this, or should we ban this book because of this? And I think that brings a whole new monitor, because you see across the country, school board members are getting harassed by parents, which I am against violence, but you can be subtle and still get your point across, in my opinion.
Right.
And so how do you balance that between that type of behavior as well as just trying to mold them? And that's probably a loaded question.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things, and a couple of things I would put into the category of things we need to do more of,
Mm-hmm.
and then other things we need to stop doing or doing.
Right.
And by the way, I'll just say that I said the number one frustration that educators feel is they get really annoyed, and that's putting it very lightly, at politicians who make decisions about what happens in our schools who have absolutely no clue. And so what we need to do is honor and respect the fact that people that go into education go through a lot of training. They go to college. They are prepared not just as experts in their content areas, but also to learn proven pedagogy. What works in terms of connecting with kids, and what are the things that we need to understand in order to make sure that we're reaching all kids. Because not all the same strategies work with every student. So one thing that is in that category of things that we shouldn't be doing is watering down standards, moving, if we see shortages of just saying, well, anybody can do it, because we know clearly that's not the case. We have to have high standards. We have to make sure that support systems are in place. And we need to honor and respect the professionalism of people who have committed their careers to serving students in this way. The other thing that we need to do, like kind of on the positive end, one, we got to make sure that we're adequately paying educators. One of the things that prevents a lot of people from choosing education as a career is that as much as people might feel like that calling and inspiration in doing that, and everybody needs to do that, that's not enough. People still need to pay their bills. They need to be able to put food on the table. And there's a lot of people, put themselves in a lot of debt, to successfully get through college in order to earn that license and earn that degree. So we need to be taking away financial barriers that prevent people from going into education, and then make sure that once they're in our schools, that they're being paid a livable wage. But we also have to make sure that we're investing in the support systems that are important. You mentioned professional development. That's not just in preparation, that's also ongoing, so that we can all, continue to sharpen the saw and make sure that we're, on top of the trends in our curriculum, on top of the trends in terms of instructional strategies, making sure that we've got strong mentoring programs in place. Half the people who go into teaching leave within the first 5 years because they don't feel supported enough in the work that they do. Sometimes, teaching can be a very isolated experience, and unless schools and unless our system is really intentional about making sure that people feel that kind of support. And then the other thing is providing respect and making sure that we're attending to working condition issues. We have reasonable class sizes, that there are staff in place to support the needs of students, so that it's not all on the plate of the classroom teachers, and that we're lifting up teachers and celebrating them, not just during Teacher Appreciation Week, but every week throughout the year. I think the more we do that and young people see that, more people are going to choose education as a career field. Some schools are doing a really, I think, good work in terms of growing their own and recognizing that if we can start encouraging people in middle school and high school to think about a career in education, and that planting those seeds early is really important. So all of those things are important. What we need to get away from is the blame game, more and more obsession with standardized testing, We need to get away from these, silly political attacks that a lot of times, are using race and gender and other issues to just drive wedges and distrust between communities and educators. And by the way, all that is not in response to any like real problems in our schools. It's all about trying to score cheap political points in order to win votes in elections. And I think most people see through that. But those kinds of things take their toll.
Well, I think you look at it as twofold. Like I'll give you a perfectly good example. You mentioned about kind of mentoring those high school, middle school to kind of become educators. One of our honorees, or I should say one of our teachers that we're going to be honoring, her mom was a teacher. So she's like, oh, I wasn't going to be in the political field. I was going to be not, I'm sorry, take that back. I'm thinking you'd be in politics. Look at you. Look great on the political wing. Her mom was teaching her all the standards she never knew. And then one day it clicked in her hand. And it's like, hey, that's education. And then she went right into the field.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I think, I know so many people, who are educators and they're second or third generation. My parents weren't teachers, but I remember my grandmother. She was a fourth grade teacher outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, not too far from you. And in fact, I even remember when I was a really young kid, she went on strike with her union, standing up with her colleagues to win a better contract. And that was my first introduction to the whole idea of unionism and solidarity, which again is another thing that's really important. I talked a minute ago about how teaching sometimes can feel very isolating, but where there's real power is when we recognize that it's not about closing the door and doing your own thing. It's about recognizing that teaching really is a team sport. And when we're there to support one another, when we're there to lift one another up and learn from each other, give each other ideas, team together in the work that we do with students, collaborate in terms of identifying what student needs are and collaborating on our curriculum and instructional strategies, that's when we can really have the most success. And in my experience over the last 30 years, the best teaching experiences I had were when I was team teaching with other people. So that's fundamentally what our union's all about. OEA is the largest labor union in the state of Ohio. We're the largest advocacy organization for public education and students in the state of Ohio, 120,000 members strong. And fundamentally, the reasons why people, choose to belong to the union, one is because of those connections, those relationships and support that they get from one another. Two, it's because of the protection and advocacy that the union provides, knowing that people have your back when you're doing this important work with students. And third, it's about collectively, we can do so much more together to influence the decisions that those politicians in Columbus are making, or the politicians in Washington are making, to try to get better policies and to make sure that our schools are fully funded. Those are things that we're able to do when we join forces and lock arms together.
We talk about, and we've talked, politics kind of turns everything upside down in some shape or form. I mean, we've seen that the last probably 20 years. There's always something, no matter if it's education or just another subject in general. How do you educate the elected officials in what your needs, kind of working with them to say, hey, this is what we're about and this is what we feel is necessary inside education? How do you do that? Because you know how it is. Politicians do what they will do, or elected officials will do. So how do you do that and kind of educate them on education?
Yeah, there's a couple things that we do as an organization that I think really makes a difference. One is we encourage our members to be politically active themselves, as much as everybody would like to be able to do their thing and pretend like politics doesn't have any influence on our schools. The reality is that virtually every aspect of our profession is influenced by elected officials or appointed officials who are making political decisions, from funding to curriculum to class size to whether or not we have safe and healthy working environments. So So one thing is to be engaged, and we encourage members to have conversations with their elected officials, to share their stories, by going to meet with them in their offices, or even better, inviting elected officials into their classrooms to see firsthand what the challenges are that they face, and what the great work is that they're doing, so that those people, when they're making decisions, when they're voting on bills, can do it in an informed way. The other thing that's really helpful is that we encourage educators to consider running for office themselves. We have a number of people in the legislature who are former teachers, and some of those individuals are some of our greatest advocates. Up in Northeast Ohio, for until recently, John Patterson from Ashtabula County, Jefferson local. He had spent a career in the classroom. He was actually a local union leader, retired from teaching, was elected to the state legislature, and became one of our strongest advocates on school funding. Joe Miller is a fellow social. In fact, John also, like me, was a social studies teacher. Joe Miller, a social studies teacher from Lorain County.
History buffs.
Yeah. Mary Lightbody is a former educator, and actually still teaches at the college level while she's, doing her legislative work. And we have a number of other people like that who are really good. And so encouraging people to take that step and run for office. It's not something that most people can do, but the more educators who are actually members of the legislature, the better off we are, because these now are people making decisions who really do get it.
Well, and that's good, because they can talk to their colleagues and say, "Hey, I was in the classroom. This is what has happened, and this is the resources XYZ needs to continue." And we talk about legislators and elected officials. I think the biggest thing I've always asked, or I've always thought about, is how schools are funded in the state of Ohio. Because I think for almost 20 years, there was correct me if I'm wrong, an Ohio Supreme Court said the funding of how schools are funded in the state of Ohio was unconstitutional.
Right.
And I know I think they finally a couple of years ago actually did something with it. Or what's kind of the notion of funding in general?
Yeah. So it was actually 25 years ago, this spring, in March of 1997, when the Supreme Court ruled for the first of four rulings that our system of funding schools was unconstitutional. One, because there was huge inequity, because so much of the system is based on property taxes, which ties to property wealth, and there is so much inequality across the state when it comes to that, but also because there just wasn't enough money being put into the system to meet everybody's needs. So the good news is kind of what you're alluding to, and I mentioned John Patterson a little while ago. Last year, in 2021, as part of the state budget, there was a new funding formula that was built in that we have been championing for a while, and John Patterson's one of the authors of that. That really identifies what are the components of a quality education, and then how much money does it take to ensure that every single student, regardless of where they are in the state, has what they need for that quality education, and then comes up with a formula to fairly distribute the funding from the state to supplement the funding that gets raised locally, and do that in a way that provides a lot more equity than the system historically has done. So that was the good news. We have a formula now in place that we can build on for the future, that I think will create a long-term constitutional system.
Why was I hearing that there's
the bad news
in this?
The big but in this is that the legislature only funded about a third of the money that was called for in the formula in the last budget, and they didn't make a commitment beyond this current 2-year period. And we need about $1.5 billion more in order to fund the formula. And so we're going to be back at it in the legislature next year to advocate for, fully and fairly funding our schools to finish the job that they started. And which means that we have to really be paying attention in the elections coming up to make sure that people are elected to office who are committed to doing that work, from the governor on down to the state senate and state reps. So so it's a work in progress. We're moving slowly in the right direction. We're just not there yet.
Little win at a time. Yeah, and I think the big the funny part about this is our elections in general. Our elections are May 3rd, if we have them, and let alone those maps are another story and a half that we could spend an hour on, but I don't want to talk about it. Right. I know we've talked a little bit about a variety of things that are affecting education, from kind of the positives, the negatives, from classroom to other parts of education. What do you think is probably the biggest issue on the table, let alone throwing politics out the door, that is something that should be addressed in education in the state of Ohio and maybe United States?
I think one thing is, really taking a hard look at for me, what was the biggest learnings from the pandemic. And that is that it put a spotlight, and in some ways it made worse, a lot of inequities that exist.
Right. That did show, it did come up. It came to light when we knew that the really problem was little, but we didn't know how big it really was until it actually happened.
Right. And kind of underlying that is that schools don't exist in a vacuum. That student success in school depends a lot on the level of support that they have outside of school. So are students nourished? Do students have access to healthcare? Do students have mental health support? Are students in communities where they have the kind of support from their families that they need to be successful? Because we saw that when everything went remote, schools did I think, really creative job turning on a dime to keep learning going. But in places where we have larger concentrations of kids in poverty, we saw a lot of kids just kind of fell off the radar. Absenteeism went way up. In fact, I was talking to a group of teachers yesterday who were saying, yeah, it's even being back to normal, so to speak, in some cases where you don't have enough parental support at home, kids, are still, it's a struggle to get them engaged. And so we have to make sure that in order for schools to do what they need to do, which is really help every student, with their academics so that they're graduating college or career ready to be good citizens, when they go out in the world and create a bright future. We have to make sure that schools have funding to address all of those social needs, all of those economic needs, all of those emotional needs that kids and families have, so that schools are really an important part, kind of a hub of communities where we're all working together to make sure that the kids have what they need to be successful. And that means really paying attention to equity. It's not just making sure that everybody's got an equal slice of the pie. It's also making sure that you're directing resources where they're needed the most. Some schools just need more help than others because some kids and some families just need a lot more support than others.
And I think the biggest token on that is just what people are now starting food pantries in their own schools, which they didn't have 20 years ago. Right. And they're asking for donations across the board, and they're getting them. And it's a community, like you said, it's a community effort around that school. And if you don't do that, that school just will have a hard time getting attendance from kids.
So, I think it's really commendable what a lot of schools are doing in terms of providing that extra support. But it can't be piecemeal, and we can't just depend on, the goodwill of people, their charitable giving. That gets so some of it, but it has to be like systemic. We have to look at the whole system. We have to make sure that the the state is doing its job that the Constitution requires, which is fully and fairly funding our schools. And in doing that, looking at the whole picture and not just, the narrow issue of academics.
We look at it as like if sometimes these schools just don't have the money to provide resources, and they're really trying to find ways of getting support. And so how do you get around that when your schools don't have the resources that they're supposed to, and some schools don't have access to school supplies, and kids don't have access? How do you get around that?
Right. I mean, again, it boils down to having a system that is fundamentally one, determining the cost of an education based on the actual needs of students, and number two, fairly distributing the resources of the state to communities based on need. So we're getting there. One of the good things that happened coming out of the pandemic is that the federal government really stepped up and provided a lot of additional support. Again, each good news piece has another side of the story. We see a lot of those federal funds that haven't been spent yet because some school district officials are like, we're not really sure how to plan and how to predict what's going to be happening, at the state level. And so, there's a little bit of hoarding of funding in some cases. There's also a number of districts that have decided they're going to hire new staff and use some of these relief funds for that purpose. But the job market right now is tough. And again, we brings us back to the educator shortage issue and the need to really, lift up and support educators, including social workers and nurses and counselors and all of that. So it's a big challenge. It's all of these issues are connected with one another. What gives me hope is that, I see our members working together, really advocating for solutions. I see people that continue through very, very challenging circumstances to do great work, creative work in meeting the needs of kids. I continue to see in my visits of schools all across the state, really exciting things happening in our classrooms, creative options for kids, including career and technical programs, including, College Credit Plus, including arts and music and phys ed and all those kinds of things and extracurricular programs, to provide that well-rounded education that students need. We just have to make sure that we're providing the resources, that we're attracting teachers by lifting up the profession, and that we stay focused on the things that matter and don't allow ourselves to be distracted by some of these, peripheral political arguments that sometimes, suck the wind, I think, out of the sails of some of our educators.
Yeah, I think you're hitting it on. We want to make sure that funding comes to our educators for the ARP money that the government has been providing, as well as whatever other resources, because at the end of the day, they would have never been able, maybe, I'm not going to quote any superintendents. I've had superintendents on my show, and they did talk about what was going behind the scenes, because parents were like, what's going on? What's happening? So they were wasting their budgets on cleaning supplies, sanitation, and they didn't have a choice. So I get it. And I hope that education can be funded, because at the end of the day, that's probably one of the very few things that every family and every kid will ever go through is K to 12.
Yeah, and the other thing too is recognize that embedded in the Constitution of the state of Ohio, and this goes all the way back to, well, it goes back to before the founding of the state, but clearly identified in going back to the 1850s, I think it was the 1851 Constitution, is a priority of funding public education and making sure that in the language used in the Constitution is a thorough and efficient system of common schools across the state. One of the challenges that we have in ensuring that our public schools are adequately funded is that there's been a lot of dilution of resources money going to charter schools that are unproven, and a lot of cases, these are for-profit operations that are more about making money for their investors than they are about providing quality outcomes for kids, and especially some of these online programs, very, very poor quality for students. So that is one of the challenges. There's also a push to expand funding for private school vouchers, and again, there are plenty of people who make the choice to send their kids to non-public schools. That's fine, but the Constitution is clear that the obligation of the state is to fund our public schools, and so we have to make sure that the focus is really there. The 90% of kids who are attending our public schools, and making sure that our public schools are fully and fairly funded. So there are some challenges, and that's where politics comes into it at times. But really making sure that the resources are there. And again, for those people that have chosen education as a career, knowing that it's hard. This year especially has been really hard, knowing that people in the community have their backs, knowing that they have a union that has their back. And I think, hopefully we're going to continue to advocate to make sure that public officials, people that are making those critical decisions, have their back as well.
Well, okay, social studies teacher, bringing out a history lesson for us all.
My pleasure. Yeah,
Scott, it's always a pleasure. I'm glad last time we talked about 2 years ago. It's great to kind of get an update of what's going on, because we know that the pandemic really put a burden on it. I think everything in the world, and I think this was just a good way to kind of overall update kind of what's been going on, and just how times have changed just in 2 years.
Yeah, for sure.
So I appreciate it, but then we're going to have some fun. You ready for some wacky questions at the end of this?
Sure. Fire away.
Yeah. I like to say this, so any answer you give can be personal or professional, either or. It's your prerogative. What's your best experience?
My best experience, I assume, kind of related to being a teacher.
It could be yourself. It could be marriage. It could be your kids. It could be whatever.
Well, I mean, that's a big question. I don't know if I can say best, but one experience that I'll just I'll lift up, was not too long ago, running into a former student. I think it was like through Facebook, but somebody who, just sent me a note and said, "Hey, I really appreciated the connection that we had, in your class. I learned a lot from your class. And I am pursuing education myself." That's the kind of thing that just kind of keeps you going, and lifts you up sometimes when things kind of seem rough. But yeah, anytime I see former students of my own who say, "Yeah, I want to make a difference. I'm going into education myself," it's really cool.
Okay, what's your best memory?
Again, that's a really big question.
That's why I'm asking these
and
questions.
I don't know if I can say one single best thing, but a memory that stands out for me, is going back to my very beginning of my teaching career. I was I had just been hired to teach social studies at Toll's Career and Technical Center, which is vocational school outside of Columbus. I was going to be teaching American history and geography to students who were in all different career tech programs. And it was an environment that was different than I had experienced before. But my teaching partner and my mentor, I remember her, reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, you ever thought about joining the union?" And I'm like, "Where do I sign up? How do I get involved?" And from then, I felt so supported. I felt, not just by her individually, but by this group of people. And this was a small school, and we had a small union, but that kind of lit a fire for me that just kind of kept me going. But I think back often to that day, when that local association, leadership team, took a small group of us, out to dinner and to kind of orient us to this new school. invited us to belong to the association, and it's been an incredible experience, ever since.
Okay. So this may be their answer that I'm looking for. Who's your role model?
Well, her name's Wendy Nichols. She definitely was one person, who really stood out. This was my, social studies teaching partner, right at the beginning of my career. And I have seen, so many other people who have been just really strong. I believe strongly in mentoring and quality mentoring programs. In fact, OEA has been investing in a pilot called Educators Leading the Profession, where we're providing virtual instructional coaches and building mentors to early career educators, and just getting tremendous feedback from the people that are involved in it. So I always think about Wendy. She was my mentor. She was my role model, both on the professional side in terms of being a good teacher. She was a great teacher, but also being a leader in our union.
Okay. Okay, last question. If there was one, so this ought to be right up your alley. If there was one person you'd want to meet, past or present, who would it be and why?
Oh boy.
These make you think more, don't they?
They do. They do. And I, as a history person, there are a couple of, historical figures. I've always had a fascination with presidents of the United States. In fact, a little fun fact about me, when I was 6 years old in first grade, I could name every single president of the United States from George Washington. I won't tell you who was president at the time, but before your time, Tony, for sure.
Hey, you'd be surprised how old I am. I'm
But,
Italian. We're Italians.
But yeah, and one person in particular, I think that always fascinated me, and he was somebody who was very progressive and played such an important role in terms of kind of the through the civil rights movement, and I think just the optimism of the early 1960s was John F. Kennedy. If I could go back and have a conversation with JFK, be there, experience that Camelot, era, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah. If you ever get a chance, go to his library in Boston.
Yeah, I've been there. It's great.
It's one of a kind. That was one of my bucket lists back in the day. I was able to do that. Scott, it's a pleasure. I appreciate your time. Everyone, thank you for joining us. If you want to check out who our inspirational teachers of the week are during Teacher Appreciation Week, please check out anthonyvspano.com. Thank you to all the educators out there for what they do for our kids. Have a good night, everyone. Check us out for more stories, events, and podcasts at anthonyvspano.com. Scott, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Tony. You take care.